So how did I get to the castration part? It's an easy leap from Jane Austen to a story that begins with castration. It's not that easy, but I loved Mansfield Park. I was swept up with it. And when I was starting my PhD work, I had 5 questions, five self-interrogations that I had to do, and that was the first part of the program. And so I wrote those 5 questions, and I thought, great, I'm past those 5 questions. Now I can get on to the writing of the story. But they came back. They came back at night, all these questions, and they kind of pounded themselves into a single amulet or a piece of veal or whatever it is. There was a single thing, and that is, how do you come up with a sympathetic main character? With the emphasis on the SYM in sympathy. Because readers are the ones who take all the chances in this equation. And I think of a story where you suspend your disbelief. A story as an out-of-body experience. Readers are giving up everything to shape-shift into a main character, to dare to travel into that main character and experiment to try on that world. And so I think that's singular in the arts. I'm in the right room, I think, to say that. But if you look at a painting, you can say, that painting knocks me out, or I'm galvanized by that painting. But in a story, it's not an illusion of 3 dimensions, it's more than 3 dimensions. You're traveling, you're suspending your own self. You're becoming a different kind of human, a kind of, I think there's a title for it when there's a reading person, it's Homo Legens, L-E-G-E-N-S, where you've had to shape people back to the present when they're lost in a story. And so, who does that better than Jane Austen? She does it on purpose, she does it unconsciously, she does it as a huge vertical talent. I was jealous of it, and so my craven plan was to find how is it that I loved Fanny so much? Because here I was, a guy, and by the way, there were men up through World War II, and now we're just guys. So here I was, a guy. How could I give up everything, all my presumed manhood, implicit with that? How could I give up everything and want to be poor Fanny in Mansfield Park? And I studied it, and I used ancient 3x5 cards. I did everything to plot out, how is this magic character so magic? And I realized it's not what Fanny has, it's what she doesn't have. She's not allowed to own her own horse. She is a poor relation of her cousins that own Mansfield Park, so she's barely on the bus. She's barely there in Mansfield Park when everyone else is in their own, in the center of their power zones. And here, this is this outsider, which is such a good figure for the reader. This outsider introduced into this exotic setting. She's not allowed to take part in the amateur theatricals. And here she is with all this interiority, so the reader's going, oh, not Fanny? Because everybody else is going to do their half-baked job in the amateur theatricals, but not our Fanny that we're already invested in. And my favorite part is that she's not allowed, or she doesn't allow herself to light her own fireplace in her icy bedroom. At the end of Mansfield Park, when she and Edmund impossibly get together, she lights the fireplace. And Freud, and it's not just Freud, will tell you that the fireplace is a psychosexual symbol for the sex acts completed, for the feminine imagery. And so there's this scorching fire at the end of it. And I thought, Freud would say, in 1922 again, that Fanny had been psychically, symbolically, culturally castrated. So I wondered, would I understand more about what the nature of sympathy if I were to start with a castrati who actually chose this because he had nothing else and he had a great talent?
I wanted to sort of pick up on one of the things you mentioned, specifically that status of the outsider. I think that's so fascinating, and in the book, as I've mentioned, the character coming from Italy to the US and the character having been castrated, having become this sexual outsider to what is considered the norm. And I was wondering why those layers came about for you, and what sort of outside perspective can do for the internal world of your character and the internal world of your novel itself.
Well, I've always been attracted to outsiders, people on the periphery, and I'll give an example of smokers. I'm not a smoker, but consider what's happened to them. At one time, being a smoker in the 1920s meant that you had it going on. That was stylish. It was fantastic. And then, after a while, the castration process begins, and you become, well, someone who smokes. One of those poor people standing out in the rain. You can see how they're marginalized. And now, they're almost capitalized as a target. They're smokers. There's another example of an outsider. I know a person who wasn't allowed to wear the color blue when she was growing up as a girl. Do you know why that is? It was her mother's color. Another time I was watching television, stage mothers, and a stage mother was telling her little daughter in a tutu, "You're going out there on that stage, get through that curtain, you've got to pull yourself together, man up." So this idea of the person on the outside, and what is more geographically seductive than being in exile? So Raffi's sent across, what happens is, it's the 20th century when the operation happens, if you want to call it a lot of quick motions on a butcher table in Naples in operation. When it happens, a cardinal rushes in and says, "The church is out of the monster business. We're exiling you to America, out of sight, out of mind, and you will never sing again." So he's exiled to the United States, yet another way of not fitting in, with an ache to find a genuine love song and without the ability to sing it. The Bronx, USA, 1907. "Hello," a cross-eyed boy said. "Lo," said another, holding one hand behind his back. After supper, the boys climbed the stairs to their dormitory and bragged in the fading light. "I can wiggle my ears," Cross-Eyes said. "Look." But no one could see any movement. "Okay, I can also touch my elbows behind my back. That's just something to get girls to try." "I have 6 fingers," Hidden Hand said. He spit 3 times. "Technically you have 5 fingers," Raffi said, "and a thumb." As the boys laughed, Raffi shuddered to think they might soon find a similar way to define him. He determined to remember. The cross-eyed boy's name was Aaron. Hidden Hand was Joe. "What can you do?" they asked Raffi. "How about sneeze with my eyes open?" He detonated a pulmonary and nasal bomb so explosive and unblinkingly calm, the others were startled into silence, then burst into laughter. A sharp voice from the hall said, "That's enough, boys." The lights went out. Blinded, Raffi sat on his bunk and waited until the others' breathing became more even. A red glow began to appear around the edges of the curtains. Sure he couldn't sleep a wink, he stole across the room and looked under the shade. Across the Harlem River was an enormous billboard sign in letters illuminated by a battery of incandescent lights. Prancing against its stage was a huge red devil entertaining the moon and the stars. Who was this primo uomo in the footlights of the Manhattan firmament? Raffi marveled at the pointed tines of his pitchfork, his pointed beard, pointed tail, and pointed horns that carried such a grave weight. His reflected glare dipped the neighboring rooftops in red. This must be an American Rigoletto, a juicy part to play, a surefire star maker. With luck and hard work, he might one day capture exactly that top-liner role. Everything was supposed to be possible here. Just then, a locomotive hurtled through a bridge toward the skyline, slashes of lightning sparkling around its wheels. The Underwood devil on the sign disappeared. It reappeared, disappeared, reappeared, disappeared for 12 seconds as the train passed through, bursts of light flashing between boxcars as the devil danced. This was really something. Who needs the Jubilate Deo? He returned to his cot, arranging his pillow so he could keep an eye on the window. As his lids got heavy, he thought he could see the incandescent devil through the shade. A part of Raffi slipped to the river and turned back to his window. Like a fairy prison, the orphanage watched from the top of its palisade. He dreamed he climbed to the top of the brilliant white bridge to see the tall buildings Sister Kay had shown him when coming into port. By the time a few weeks had passed, Raffi had a good many pals among the boys. This was all right. It was like being back with the choristers, just a fist fight or two from a real gang. Every day after classes, he'd see Sister Kay. "Hello, Raffaele," she'd say. Her voice sounded so much like home. "In English," Raffi joked. Then they talked like brother and sister. Many evenings he'd see her too, because she worked in the library, which drew Raffi closer. After the library was closed, in the fragrant quiet of her room, she let him curl up under her arm while she read The Emperor and the Nightingale. "This is how you'll improve your English, Raffi." When they read Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens together, the misty tendrils of the story crept in and surrounded the divan. "There's a place like this I can show you," she said. The next full moon, she took him to Van Cortlandt Park. Inside the shiny black gate, a herd of deer stood very still beside a pond that glowed in the nocturnal gloom. "Get closer, one step at a time," she said, "so they won't see us." At first, when he tried it, they scattered like a deck of cards. "You'll get it," she said. Walking home, she held his hand. Night after night, he returned to the park. A month later, he invited Sister Kay to Van Cortlandt again. "That's close enough," she said softly. But Raffi kept walking without a sound to a lost spot of green wakened by moonlight. He closed his eyes, extended his palm with a lump of precious sugar saved from his own tea ration, and a fawn skipped up to him. Slowly, he laid his hand on the fawn's hot, hopped back and caressed it. The creature trembled, but didn't try to run. Sister Kay caught her breath. You have a wonderful gift, Raffi. Don't let anyone tell you you don't.
Thank you very much. As I make no apology. So much about the modern US is explained in this novel, not in a didactic manner, but on its own, lying in exaggerated terms. And I wanted to ask you about that and ask, was this a deliberate choice? Did you set out to say something, or did this sort of arise organically as you sort of delved into your novel and really got into the nuts and bolts of how you were constructing this narrative?
When I first started to map out this fable, it was all about the readers and the out-of-body experience and the storytelling. But what's fun is that other things came flooding in without my doing any work at all. And the thing about America, you can't write a story where you cross a duplicitous ocean like that, which is so much like stepping through a mirror. Or maybe the Atlantic is like a big changing room, and you come out a different person on the other side, and the same thing goes this way. Momentarily here in Britain, I have a transpontine allure. All my mistakes are charms, and I've made them. I have 1,000 haunts of people since I drove up from London. But naturally, there's a great tradition of crossing, this geographic crossing, this transitional crossing, this personal psychic geography when you go through a barrier. It's such a big thing, but it goes back to Candide. It goes back to Kafka. There's a story about when Kafka was writing America with a K, he'd make his family listen again and again. This doesn't happen in my house, but to what he's read, laughing at his own jokes again and again. And I think that there's this different set of silk screenings of motion traveling one place or another. And I think that some of these elements came in unbidden, and it goes back further to very ancient ocean crossings. So I didn't want to write a roman à clef where there's a key to every single person, but things did sort of settle into shape. I didn't want to do an allegory. I wanted to write a beautiful story about Raffi, but once Raffi has an opposition character, and it's his own misapprehensions about whether or not he can have love. It's Alessandro Moreschi, the putative last castrato. It's America, it's what he hasn't done. All of these things that we all feel, they do fit into a fable, the way they mentioned in the review.
Excellent. It's a fascinating way of sort of getting into something that is quite dense and quite insightful through a very organic process, through something very real, and sort of wanting to tell a story, being at the heart of it, I think is very admirable and very encouraging to sort of see that's how the novel almost came about.
Well, when I had to cover the trail and remystify this novel, but before I had to demystify it, I could never have marketed it as this, but it's a Menippean satire. And Menippus is great for a budding scholar because none of his works exists, so that if you attribute something to Menippus, no one can ever call you on it. But famously, the thing about Menippus is he's called the joker about serious things. And I've dedicated this book to a friend from Bamberg who said to me once, "Must everything be a joke to you?" And I think that is how I handle uncomfortable situations, with lame humor. And I think that humor also gives adds to narrative tension. And when I don't think it's funny, but I think anyway, a Menippean satire is A Clockwork Orange, or Catch-22, or a lot of things where there's a story first, but then there are these reverberations of a society that is unstuck in time. It's not just now. It's not just 1922, but a great Menippean satire, and I don't pretend to have written one, but I do pretend to aspire to one. A great one is intertemporal. All the different eras are encompassed in this story that keeps on going forever and doesn't have a present, past, or future. When Raffi gets there, and he does across time sense that he's the only, he doesn't have this feeling, just there's a growing awareness, I hope, with the reader that in some ways he's the only whole person navigating through a castrated society where everyone can't wear the color blue or whatever it is. He runs into Victor, a fellow sufferer in the sense that he was born into one of Boston's wealthiest families. He's supremely talented, but he's labeled a bastard and scorned by his boss and half-brother. He's relegated to sleeping in the basement of the Parker House Hotel because, scandal alert, he's mixed race and blind. So here's a section with Raffi and Victor, where Raffi realizes maybe he's had it bad, but others have had it worse. It was nearly, I better say, chapter 9. He who follows the blind will end up in the ditch. Boston, 1922. It was nearly 1 a.m. by the time Raffi and Victor put on their street clothes and ascended the stairs from the hotel's service catacombs to a world of cool air. Victor pushed open the lead-lined door off School Street into Roll Alley, moonlight glinting on slimy cobblestones. "This is a bit of a shortcut," Victor said. "Hope you don't mind the company." He bent over, tucked his trouser cuffs into his boot tops, and started a slow prance, like Gloucester and King Lear, lifting his knees high in the air with each step. Raffi heard a rustle and peered into the shadows. Rats, their fur dark as Venetian canals, eddied around rusty barrels and below a vent fragrant with the smell of Parker House rolls. Their lookout stopped and stared at him with red-rimmed eyes before slipping into a drain pipe. "This reminds me of home," Raffi said. "Oh, but this is really the highest class garbage," Victor said. "Thieves, burlesque stars, and merchant princes have wound up face to face here after falling on bad times. Rats included? Anyone's a good dinner companion when you're hungry." "I've dined here a time or two myself," Victor said. "It's so much more intriguing if you can't see who's sitting across the table." Raffi eyed the rusty barrels. "How often are these emptied?" "Before the typhus scare, we used to leave them out a couple of days for the pickers to go through, a sort of charity for the world of the great unwashed, and the rats remember. Now the dustmen attend to the cans 3 times a day, but in spite of everything we do, some precious crumbs of the rolls leave a trail to the door after sweep up, and a few morsels still drop from the scullery window. The rats know if they wait here, they might catch a piece like a penny from heaven. By dawn, there won't be a speck of anything out here but stone. When you think of it, it's a coordinated effort. The rats are our third shift cleanup crew. The Post would call them our new citizens, stealing jobs from perfectly loyal union members." Victor winked. "I think it was Southey who suggested the best way to make rats disappear is to make them a table delicacy." "No," Raffi said. "Extol their powers as an aphrodisiac." Victor paused. "There's something else about this place. There are other monsters here. That's when taking out the trash doesn't mean taking out the trash. It's a way station for a different kind of rat." As a bulky figure slipped among the shadows and out of view, Victor pulled Raffi toward him and whispered, "That guy works for the real mayor of Boston. Tourists get rolled here, and old accounts get settled. Deposits are made into these cans on their way to the mudflats on Jeffreys Point, where they turn cods inside out and dry them on the rocks. Screeching cats won't let the dead sleep. The smell of cod is the only thing strong enough to drown out the smell of garbage and dead bodies. He resumed his curious walking. Maybe the rats aren't after the rolls, but the rolled. If I were you, I wouldn't look under those lids. Victor turned a corner and Raffy quickened his own pace, mimicking his steps. The blind leading the blind, Victor said. Raffy stayed close. It was always good to know where an urban oasis of free food was, because one never knows, does one? If nothing else, it was a reason to be cheerful. Suddenly Victor stopped short at the curb of a wide boulevard, turned his head, and listened for the sound of approaching traffic. It's all clear, Raffy said. Take note of where you are, Victor said. Look up. Do you see a golden dome up ahead? That's the State House. In my mind, it's something out of the Arabian Nights. Have you always been blind? I was 4 when I fell down a flight of stairs. Ever since, I've been looking for a black cat in a basement without a candle. Now it's your turn. Raffy swallowed. Maybe it would be easier to tell someone who couldn't look him in the eye. I wanted to be a great opera singer where I grew up in Naples. It was what I trained to be. I didn't have anything else. So I agreed to the alteration, though all the roles for castrati had disappeared. Overnight, the world decided that the sound of a castrato was a horrible reminder of human pain, no sweeter than the sound of your black cat being strangled. Victor's Adam's apple traveled up his throat like a rodent on a rust pipe as he swallowed. He turned back to the street. No, he said. I meant you were supposed to turn here.
I did. I wanted to ask you about one other character that features in the novel, and that's the character of Amy Lowell. I know I have to confess I don't know too much about her as a real poet, though I know she won the Pulitzer Prize posthumously for her poetry. I wanted to ask you, as a writer, dealing with a real person, if you like, that's being put into your novel, how did you sort of go about that? How did you feel including someone who has a reality, has a faithful interpretation as a creative person, as a creator of this work?
It's a responsibility to change central elements of her character. I think of it as a heightened reality. Just like at the British Tate, there's a show, Artist and Empire, and they show a picture, a beautiful painting of General Wolfe flickering near death in Canada, and he's surrounded by angelic other colonels and soldiers, and then they have Native Americans coming there, and I've always realized that I consider that the truth, and now I understand that there are things called historical moment painters, who, if there were no Native Americans, there certainly should have been there if we have only one painting to paint. And so there's something artistically and intellectually honest about including them in a composition that's responsible. And besides, it's more true than the truth from an artistic point of view. Tim O'Brien, the novelist, was asked that question. Was there really a Dick Lemon who was exploded in Vietnam and all his parts were draped over a lemon tree? And he said, no, I worked on this. It's better than the truth. Now with castration, I could say just some people that are put off by it, even though it's just a fable and it's only in the first chapter, skip it if you like. I mean, some people read it with their hands over, or with their adductor muscles, held tight or something like that. My dream of an opening opening chapter. But after that, it does. It's story driven, so it's more than that. But the people that don't get past that, they can't handle the untruth. I just want to give people a ride and have them do that out-of-body experience. So anyway, I think that there's a grand tradition, just hitherto not all that recognized, of people improving upon the truth, and the truth is something that dances out of view, and it's hard to follow anyway. The minute you have someone telling you, in fact, I have that as a character tick. I have a person saying, "To be perfectly honest with you." And so you can tell whether what follows is going to be completely honest or not. But I'd be an out-and-out liar to say that I knew the truth about anything.
So I confess that having read that first chapter myself, I certainly sort of walked shyly for the next couple of moments after having finished it. I wanted to sort of move on from that. We talked a lot about sort of construction and the idea of writing as an art form. I wanted to ask you, so we've spoken a lot about Raffi and how he came to being and how you were interested in creating him. I wanted to ask what your opinion was on the idea of sort of how the plotting of the novel took place, in that how much the events were shaped by the characters and characters shaped by the events, and how that affected the world, this 1922 Boston world that they are inhabiting, and how that worked for you as a creator, as an author.
I think that it is an odyssey, for one thing, so that some of the idea of travel and chronology are great. It's almost like a story is a hovercraft, and what makes it less sliding friction for all concerned is for that hovercraft to be held aloft, and you're held aloft by a great tradition of stories where there's a Bildungsroman where the person grows with travel and with experience, and so that is aiding such a story. So there were a lot of built-in plot elements, but you do have to have something that the main character is repelled and fascinated by, a big obstacle, and then you have also antagonists. And because Raffi is not bothered by sexual static, he goes to the Parker house, and it's funny that he's sent to America because in 1922, America thought it was on the cusp of a superculture. But the idea of the Vatican was that we'll send Raffi to an absolute wilderness that's never heard of opera, and instead they send him to Boston, where they're having hallucinations of culture just then. Technology in 1922. Everyone is terrified of immigrants in Boston, so the Puritans are developing canning companies to seal off and be 100% pure because they don't know what they do. So they have these animadversions with people flooding in where they'll cross a street to talk to a visiting Italian opera performer, but then if any of that person's relatives came over, they'll cross back over to the other side. So there's this strange selectiveness. So I have the hypocrisy of these different elements of society that take people by surprise. And there's one screenwriter's aphorism that I like to try to use, even though I'm not really a screenwriter, and that is do the opposite. So from a plotting point of view, if you're coming up to the door and you knock on the door, if a person just simply opens the door, you made a big mistake. You want some ridiculous thing to happen. And so when I think that there's this prosaic sense of what comes next, I love to play with what comes next and show, well, this is a different next. So with Amy Lowell wanted to be one of the images so much. But she had maybe a convergence of different conditions of being castrated. One was, it's kind of funny, but she was too rich. And if you go to a poetry slam, now, and if you're dressed in Armani, you'll find out that maybe you don't look or seem like a poet because there's a prescribed dress and deportment and diction for these various places. So she made that initial mistake of having too much money. So Ezra Pound loved her as long as she was giving money, but hated her when she wanted to have some artistic participation in bringing the images to America with a 3-volume anthology. So some of the mistakes that Amy made was when she came to London in 1913 to 1914, bigger news among the literati than the Sarajevo start of World War I. The assassination was that Ezra Pound and D.H. Lawrence and all of these other people in H.D. and Richard Aldington, John Kuornos, all the original images set, actually snubbed her at Hotel Dieudan in London. And they were such free thinkers, but they could selectively be very closed-minded, and they said, was it right for her to have brought her lover, Ada Russell, to London with her? Was it right for her to book a whole floor of the Berkeley Hotel and bring her 400-foot maroon Pierce Arrow with matching chauffeur and matching livery? Was that really right? Was that our kind of imagism? And so Pound just vilified her. It's funny, he was American, but one of his targets was he vilified her for being an American. But the worst thing was he said, we can only have one fat person per movement, and we already have Ford Maddox Ford. And what happened was Amy had incredible talent, but there are so many obstacles and so many ways that she was castrated. She was a woman, let's start with that. So that there were all these barriers to her. She was wealthy, she was a parvenu, she did everything wrong like that. And so could we have eyes and ears to see now some of the things that Amy Lowell has have cachet now. She was the first, just about the very first, to wear men's slacks and smoke cigars. And in 15 or 20 years later, it was also cool when Katharine Hepburn did it because she was provocatively slim. She had all those other things going for her. But Amy Lowell was a woman who wanted to barge in and manhandle the arts, use her money. And so Pound loved her and included her work in his in Les Amagis when he was just. But when he wanted $5,000 to underwrite a French literary magazine, he wanted to head up, and she said no. Things just deteriorated. It all came to a head in London at Dieudan in 1913. So anyway, so here's this juicy character of Amy Lowell. So you think that Amy would just completely reach out to someone like Raffi, completely bond with him. But she has her own cultivated blindness. Even though she loved Italy, and even though she loved how she thought of him as her own Rollo in Naples, and he was geographically bewitching for that, still, he wasn't one of her people. And so there's no allegory in this. I love it when character comes in and you want a person to be a pat character like that, and then at the last minute, you knock on the door of Amy Lowell, and it's not that Amy Lowell who opens the door. So the other characters, with Raffi going toward a finish, these are converging stories. There's a person who didn't get castrated, who ends up in America, and events conspire to make him trail after Raffi because he's on an assignment to trail after Raffi. And all the while, he's the road not taken. He didn't get castrated, and he becomes a big star in the U.S., a Rudy Valley, Frank Sinatra type. And he stands like this, he's had the kind of Dean Martin appeal, and he's Raffi's other. And so Raffi's other, just like in Crime and Punishment, where all the people around Raskolnikov are projections of his own personality, Raffi wonders, have I made all these characters up? Because as a castrato, he's a beautiful point of mediation for the reader too. He's neutral ground, and that was intellectually exciting for me. Say, how close can the reader get to this Raffi?
Excellent. I say, well, just listening to that, it's very clear the amount of research that's gone into this, and the amount of development that's done for you has been, exceptionally deep. And obviously, having done it as your PhD novel, you can see that sort of that research being a requirement of it. I was wondering, the idea of that research, and again, with it being set in 1922, there is the chance, let's say, that it would be labelled as a historical novel, a historical fiction. I was wondering what your take was on that sort of that label for your novel, whether you would agree or disagree with it, and how you would sort of term it, how you would sum it up, if you like.
Well, this whole novel is against labels. So we've learned in the novel that fat isn't such a good idea because you can't understand what a person is like. I mean, when people read online about fat shaming, it's almost as though that's a new phenomenon. But Raffi's, Amy Lowell's 1975 biography uses the word fat, I think, over 300 times. And this was a sympathetic biography. It's just all of these walls were put up, and Raffi sees them all. Here's another one. In 1922, seances were the social medium. And there are some people who were thought less of because they couldn't step into the other side. They were too plump, they were too grounded, they weren't relaxed enough. And so you didn't have cachet that way. So it could be what kind of, if you were an immigrant, if you didn't have money, all these different things. And I think that can be done to literature too. In some places, if it's called a literary novel, something that I just greatly admire, it could be the kiss of death. Imagine if I had marketed this as, called an agent and said, I've got a great Manichaean satire for you. I'm wondering how quickly you can place it. So I even toyed with, and I'd like to think of this as too, after the PhD process, I had to unpack all of that study, that deepened my own self-interrogations about it. But I had to remember too that now knowing this, how do you make it a story? Because everything is in service to the reader. The readers are kings, and so.
I'd love to give anyone here an opportunity to ask any questions, especially those of you who I know who are aspiring writers yourself. There's great opportunities that we have to ask questions of someone who has been there, done that, and done it to such an exceptionally high level. I'd really encourage any questions now. I would love to be able to take those. Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about Boston, because Boston is my favourite city in the States by far. I'm also like a big Bruins fan, so there's two things that tick myself off. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about how Boston, obviously it's a city, so how does it inform, how does it fit into your...
It's a character itself in the novel. I trained in my MFA with Dennis Lehane, and Dennis wrote Mystic River. He can talk about this puritanical kind of Boston, but he's done so wonderfully with this tough guy Boston, and so he can take us to places like Revere and Dorchester, Boston. And so there are all of these tough guy images, and the effete, strange, almost Lord Haha like pilgrims that were circling the wagons while the world was changing on Beacon Hill. I got excited. That was caviar to me, to the self-delusions of those people while the rest of reality was kicking in and landing on shore. I thought, this was a group of, this was a ship of fools, that I could follow, and see if any of them could possibly ennoble themselves.
As a writer, you're standing for many years and you're very experienced, obviously.
I'm younger than I was.
When when I'm writing something as a very beginner, as it were, let's take 1,000 words, fiction, for example, or non-fiction. I'm finding at the moment and I'll probably write 2,500 words to get 800 out of it. What's the case when you write up there? Is it
When you write more and you want it to be shorter?
Yeah, well, when you reach the standard that you're at the moment, you know, in other words, you know, you've been through where I started and reached the heights of the novel, etc. Do you still find yourself editing to that extent, where it's like that big, but I have to take that much out, you know? Does it? How is it?
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
The technical side of it. I mean, you know, do you have to take that much out to get to, and are you left with that much?
I think
that
the romantic sense of it is let the story write itself with you. There's so many different theories, but one thing that I use that's a famous one, is that you don't know where you're going, except that it's like driving on a highway, and you can see what's right in front of you. Say you're driving across the United States and you're starting on the East Coast and going to California. It's an old chestnut that you can see what's there with the headlights right in front of you, and you can make that visible and real on your own. But you also have to have a sense ultimately of where you're going. Another writer has said you take a stone and throw it as far as you can, and then to try to walk interestingly down the hill and find that stone or a different stone. But there's a lot of people write the ending first, and then they'll have an outline, but they're free to. They're only looking forward to the story, co-opting their best laid plans and changing everything, and then that's when it gets really exciting. And the best tip that I learned too late was, don't try to write like a writer, try to write like a reader.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Morning Star praised this book for being written, a big book written small, like 300 pages. Is there another 200 or 300 pages that didn't make it into the book? Do you write a lot of stuff that doesn't get into your final version? A lot of stuff that gets thrown away?
Yes. I think that not only in terms of the creative product, but academically, I had to start my dissertation all the way to zero. And that sounds like such a chastening thing, but it was a freeing thing. It was much easier than trying to take this worked over warhorse and recondition it into being something young and fresh and fun. So I think that, you know, they say cutting is writing, and whenever I just hate that, I can now look back and say some of the most beautiful things that I've ever been close to creating have become more starkly in a reader's eyes when someone has recommended that I cut it. And my wife is my writing partner, and she says something comforting. She says, "Don't worry, Colin, it's still there." Because it fills the shape where it used to be. And so in a formal sense, it is. It shaped what's the part that's cut away shapes that. So a cut is just extremely exciting. So they have the thing about Frost, Robert Frost. Yesterday I put a comment in, today I took it out. But you can go even more and you can say, I really worked hard today, I dumped 3 chapters.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me, I want to ask for a suggestion for somebody who has just started writing or just has published some few short stories. And I always have this struggle that I don't know if I start to write something and then I know that maybe this story doesn't have any chance to get published. But I know that, for example, that thing, if I write about, can be published, but I cannot, for example, I don't define myself as somebody who can write about that thing. What is your suggestion about it, about the publication and how, I can get along with this.
How do you get
No, not how to get published. No, it's not my question. Like, I think it's the matter of taste that, for example, you define your taste in a way that, you know, maybe there isn't any chance, or a very, very few chance.
Okay.
Then Milan Kundera is a great person to read about that, because if you write something that isn't absolutely new and doing it in a different way than it's ever existed before, that is writing. But if you've done something that you know is inside the circle of what's been written before, then what you've written is kitsch. And it's easier to see it if you think, what if I were a painter? And so if you go to a canal and you're working on a pretty sailboat, and there's a woman in a diaphanous white gown sitting with her child looking at the sailboat as it goes by, you have a responsibility to know that people who've done that before, when it was a fresh idea, you can only burn down that icon and be a radical postmodern painter, or find something completely new and different about it. Andrew Wyatt has a famous painting, Christina's World, and he completely nailed the tragedy of a woman who couldn't walk, looking wistfully up at across a great hiking distance toward an illusory hotel at the end. So that was great. But modern artists now, they can't do something after Christina's World. But I'll tell you what they have done. They'll riff on Christina's World, and they'll have Christina be a monster, or some terrible thing happening, or her arm being chewed off by a squirrel. But they'd rather die than just do complete kitsch. And even when you have kitsch on kitsch, then it's time to just hit the reset button and try to find something that hasn't ever been done. And do I admire something that's unwise and it takes a high risk and never gets published, but you've thrown everything you have into it? Yes. It's better to take that, and it's even better for you. So on the other hand, here's a way to be fresh that I wish I had known a long time ago. I wish the first 30 short stories I wrote weren't from the perspective of a 6-foot white man in his 20s who wished he were Stephen Dedalus. I wish I had that time back. I wish my first story had been from the point of view of someone I didn't really know anything about, because that admonition to write what you know about, it isn't literally, it's really write what you feel. Write what you have involuntarily researched. So if it's sadness, when I write about someone dying, I have a very lonely memory. I was the last person on earth to listen to the very last heartbeat of my father. My head was on his chest. And only I know how that feels. Only I know how loud that last heartbeat was, and I still hear it wherever I go. I'd like you to just write about things that hurt you, that warp you, that make people laugh at you. And those are the arrows in your quiver. The things that disfigure you. That's what we need instead of kitsch. And you can do it.
Oh, that was so beautifully put. It was like very appropriate moment to call anything like
But I've done it before, so that was kitsch.
But yes, I'd say all that really remains then is for me to say thank you very much, sir, for agreeing to speak with us this evening, and thank you to everyone here to come as well. We really appreciate this.
Thank you so much for your time. Now, this is a blood serious final announcement, and I'm going to use my gauche sense of being an American to take it across the finish line. I'm really hoping that you will buy one of these books. For one reason, Barbican Press, imagine the courage it took to look with an open heart and open eyes at a story that was from the wrong side of the Atlantic, that had nothing to recommend it, that had no social media following or other mandate, that just went, whatever the risk, like I was talking about, on, well, I like that story, and I thought about it afterward, which is the highest praise I can ever think. So I'm hoping that if you like it, you'll buy one copy. Now, if you don't like it, I'd like you to buy 2 copies and give one to somebody you don't like. So I think we are going to be selling some over there, and I hope you do take that risk and travel with Raffi Peach. Thank you so much.